morning. Some years ago when Susan and I visited Kakadu, we were supposed to go on a tour into one of the communities, but it was closed due to a death and a funeral that was happening. And so the tour guide took us into other areas, other spaces, which were remarkable. One of the spaces we went to, one of the places, looked out over Cannon Rock, but it was a billabong with an escarpment in the background. Back here there was rock formations and rock art. But perhaps the most profound part of all of that was this small cave. It wasn't that impressive to look at until you looked in, and on the wall, just a couple of metres, a metre or two in, was writing. There was English writing and Aboriginal art and pictures and diagrams. It looked like a blackboard in a school, and in fact the guide told us the story. This was Big Bill's cave. Bill Naichi, the Gagaju man, one of the elders of the people, of the Gagaju people. Bill died some years ago, but he told us the story of this incredible man. A man who'd learned the culture and ways and spirit and law of his people. But he'd also been sent to one of the mission schools, and he'd learned some of the ways of white fellas, their language and culture, and he came back to his people. And as he grew, he began to teach them, pass on the ways of their people, the Gagaju people, how to live with the land, what was good, and the seasons and the spirit and the stories, where the food could be found, and how to respect the earth and its creatures, and how to respect and live together well. But he also taught them how to understand something of the white fellas' ways, their language and culture, and to be able to connect and engage. We spent some time in silence remembering this remarkable man, trying to get a sense of his life, his world, of the beauty that was all around us that he lived with, and how he held that beauty and sustained it and helped others sustain it and live in it, live with the land. I bought a book of his, about him. It was written about him, his story, but also contained his words as people sat and listened to his poetry, his wisdom, and recorded it into this book. Inspiring, challenging, confronting words about life, the way he sees the world, and as he looks into white fellas' culture. This last week has been NAIDOC week. A week each year where particularly we hear the stories and focus on the Indigenous peoples of this land, the most ancient culture alive on earth, here for tens of thousands of years, with wisdom, with spirit, with understanding, with living in sync with this world and this earth and the beauty. But we also hear the stories of pain and suffering, the stolen generation, the various people who have lost their way, who have been pushed off land, who have lost culture and language, of the genocides and massacres that are part of our history. I remember when Ash Barty was celebrating Wimbledon wins, and Yvonne Goolagong-Cawley was part of all that celebration and telling her own story. And I remember when she was running the court at Wimbledon, I was in primary school learning Australian history, but there's none of her history. We might have heard of Bennelong because he was named after, the point in Sydney was named after him. But we didn't hear about what had happened to the Indigenous people of this land, not really. We didn't hear of their wisdom and culture, their spirit, their stories. And we didn't hear what had happened. We didn't hear of the massacres, of the power and domination over the people. We didn't hear the truth. We had a white armband view of history. This week in our story that comes from Mark's story of Jesus, It's one I try and avoid because it's brutal and horrible, violent. It's a story of Herod Antipas, the local king, who's one of the sons of Herod the Great, a violent and abusive and mad king, who did some brilliant things in building and construction, but was brutal and violent. It's a story that breaks in the sandwich in the midst of another story of Jesus, a story where he sends disciples out to minister to those in the villages and the towns, to bring healing and life and the message of love, of inclusive love, to build people up and share this love of God and bring people together in community. And after it, we'll hear more stories of what that has happened. But in the midst, Mark inserts this story of John the Baptist and Herod Antipas. It's a story, as I say, I try and avoid until I watch the evening news and realise that the story of violence, of abusive power over innocent and vulnerable people is a daily occurrence. The domestic violence is happening, the murders in streets or in knife attacks, the brutal gun slayings or violence of warfare in Ukraine and in Gaza and in other parts of the world, of the violence that's done by national leaders on vulnerable people, of Indigenous peoples in the world who are pushed off lands, who don't have big armies and guns and tanks and bombs and can't resist the domination of the powers of empire and nation. The story that we hear of John the Baptist and his death, in some senses, is a daily event. John the Baptist was outspoken, and Herod Antipas had two marriages. One was a political marriage to a Nepotian king's daughter, princess. It was a political marriage, marrying the daughter of one of his enemies to keep peace. And then he had an affair with his brother's wife, Herodias, divorced the first wife and married the second one. And John the Baptist speaks out and tells him it's wrong. It's not right, in no uncertain terms. And Herod doesn't like it, but Herod fears John the Baptist. He sees in him he's a holy man. He fears him and the God behind him. But he also likes to listen to John. He's curious and there's something wise in what John says. And so he holds him in prison, afraid to do away with him, but not wanting to release him either. His wife Herodias, on the other hand, hates John the Baptist with a vengeance and wants him dead. And she's just waiting, biding her time. And the time comes when Herod has a birthday party and he celebrates and he throws this lavish party, a wild party of excess food and alcohol and everything else. It descends into an orgy of violence, seduction and violence and death. In the party, Herodias' daughter dances. And she dances with this most seductive and beautiful dance, and she entrances all the guests and all who are there, especially Herod. And at the end of it, he's so overwhelmed, he says, ask for anything you want, even up to half of my kingdom. So she goes off to her mother and says, what shall I ask for? Herodias has no second thoughts. John the Baptist's head on a platter. So she goes back and asks for John's head on a platter. Herod is disturbed and upset. He doesn't want to do this, but he can't lose face before the guests, and he's promised. So he sends a guard down and brings back John's head. And John's disciples take the body and lay him in a tomb. That's the end of John. And this story is sandwiched between Jesus sending disciples out to share good news of healing and of life and of love, compassion and justice. And the disciples coming back and reporting. And later on a large gathering where people will gather the poor and the ordinary and the crowds of people who are looking for hope gather around Jesus, and he feeds them. And so there's so much contrast between the violence and power and domination of Herod and his ways, killing John for revenge, versus Jesus, who brings healing and life and hope. Of a lavish, exclusive dinner that descends into an orgy of violence and death and seduction. And a simple meal on the beach, which involves all people and feeds everyone. And they all have enough simple food. And they're all included and welcomed. It's this inclusive community of love and grace over and against this exclusive way of domination and power, of abuse and violence. And there's too much of that in our world. And Jesus comes to bring the way of hope and love and invites us into that way. To be people of hope, to people of life and healing and inclusion and breaking down barriers and welcoming in. And listening to one another, and particularly to those who are on the edges and those who are pushed to the edges and sides and margins. People who are ignored and silenced. But people like Bill Nighy, who has great wisdom. So I'm wondering this week, following NAIDOC week, we might listen to those stories. We might hear the wisdom of the Indigenous people. We might look at those cultural groups and ethnic groups and subgroups in our society, the people who are silenced or ignored or pushed aside, people who live with mental illness or disability or chronic health problems, people of a different gender or age or sexual orientation, people who look different, sound different, people who have a different faith or a different way of seeing the world. Can we embrace them into our community, into our lives, and share this love of God with everyone? That's the challenge for us. Will we go the way of Herod or the way of Jesus? Amen.